The morning air over Nevada's restricted airspace hung thick with secrets. Captain Leela Ghost, Kozlova, adjusted her headset one final time, the familiar weight of her helmet settling against shoulders that had carried more than their share of doubt. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon cut through the dawn sky like a blade through silk, but today felt different. Today, the radio crackled with an edge she hadn't heard since Afghanistan. Control, this is Ghost requesting Vector update on the bogies at bearing 270. Her voice carried the measured confidence of someone who had learned to speak louder than whispers suggested she should. The response came back static-filled and terse. Ghost, maintain current heading. Do not engage. But the formation ahead wasn't following any pattern she recognized from the briefing. 6 aircraft, moving in perfect synchronization, their silhouettes cutting strange angles against the rising sun. Something about their spacing triggered a memory buried deep in classified files she'd memorized years ago during her stint at the Pentagon. A memory that made her blood run cold. She keyed her radio again. Control, I need confirmation on friendly status of the formation ahead. They're not responding to standard IFF interrogation. Silence stretched across the airwaves like a held breath. When the response finally came, it carried a weight that transformed routine patrol into something else entirely. Ghost, you are ordered to maintain distance and observe only. Do not repeat, do not attempt further communication. But Leela Kozlova had earned her call sign Ghost, not for her ability to disappear, but for her talent at seeing what others chose to ignore. And what she was seeing now in the sky ahead made every instinct honed through 8 years of military service scream a single word: run. The 6 aircraft ahead had begun a subtle shift in formation, their movements precise and calculated. It was then that she recognized the pattern. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the secure communications switch, knowing that what she was about to report would change everything. The formation matched something she'd seen only once before, in a briefing room so classified that the walls seemed to absorb sound itself. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert below, Captain Leela Kozlova realized she was no longer just a pilot on routine patrol. She was the only witness to something that wasn't supposed to exist. The radio crackled to life with a transmission that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Ghost, this is Reaper 1. We see you. The voice on the radio belonged to no call sign in any database Leela had ever accessed. Reaper 1 spoke with the kind of calm authority that comes only from absolute certainty, and that terrified her more than any surface-to-air missile ever could. Her F-16's radar painted the 6 aircraft clearly now, but their signatures looked wrong somehow, as if the electrons themselves were being bent around shapes that shouldn't exist. Control, this is Ghost. I need immediate clarification on Reaper 1's authorization to operate in this airspace. Her fingers danced across the instrument panel, switching between radar modes, searching for answers that seemed to evaporate the moment she grasped them. The response from Control came after a pause so long she wondered if they'd simply abandoned their post. Ghost, Reaper flight is authorized. Continue observation protocols. But the hesitation in the controller's voice told her everything she needed to know. Whoever Reaper 1 was, they operated outside the normal chain of command. Leela's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Black operations, foreign infiltration, technology that officially didn't exist. She watched as the 6 aircraft began a complex maneuver that defied conventional tactics. They moved like a living organism, each element responding to the others with a precision that spoke of either superhuman coordination or something far more sophisticated. The morning sun glinted off surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and Leela found herself questioning whether she was witnessing aircraft at all or something masquerading as such. Her training kicked in, muscle memory guiding her hands to record everything she could. Altitude, bearing, speed, formation patterns, all of it documented with the methodical precision that had earned her commendations in 3 separate theaters of operation. But even as she gathered data, a part of her mind whispered that knowledge this dangerous had a way of disappearing, along with those who possessed it. Ghost, this is Reaper 1. Your surveillance is noted and appreciated. The words carried a weight that made her skin crawl. They knew she was recording. They knew she was analyzing. And they didn't care. That level of confidence suggested either complete legitimacy or something so far beyond legitimacy that the distinction no longer mattered. Leela adjusted her grip on the stick, feeling the familiar comfort of control surfaces responding to her touch. Whatever was happening here, she was committed now. The only path was forward, deeper into a mystery that grew more complex with each passing moment. The 6 aircraft ahead began to climb, their formation shifting once again into a pattern that tickled the edges of recognition in her mind. The pattern crystallized in her memory like frost forming on glass. Omega configuration. She'd seen it exactly once, in a briefing room 3 levels below the Pentagon, during her rotation through the Strategic Intelligence Division. The briefer had been a colonel whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much, and his words had carried the weight of absolute classification. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see represents the theoretical maximum threat response formation. If you ever encounter Omega configuration in the field, you are to report immediately through channels so secure they don't officially exist. Leela's hand moved to the encrypted communications panel almost without conscious thought. The frequency she selected existed in no manual, its existence confirmed only by whispered conversations between pilots who'd earned the right to know. She keyed the microphone with a touch so light it barely registered. Blackbird Control, this is Ghost. I have eyes on Omega configuration. Repeat, Omega configuration confirmed. The silence that followed stretched beyond anything natural. When the response came, it was from a voice she didn't recognize, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Ghost, this is Blackbird Actual. Confirm your grid coordinates and maintain observation. Do not break formation. Do not attempt to close distance. Under no circumstances are you to deviate from current flight path. But the 6 aircraft ahead had other plans. As if responding to her encrypted transmission, they began a climbing spiral that painted impossible geometries across the morning sky. Their movement held a fluidity that suggested technology far beyond anything in the conventional arsenal, and Leela felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. Her radar scope painted them clearly, but the signatures seemed to shift and flow like mercury, never quite settling into patterns her instruments could properly identify. Each sweep of the radar dish brought new impossibilities, aircraft that seemed to phase in and out of existence, speeds that contradicted visual observation, altitudes that changed without corresponding movement. Reaper 1, this is Ghost. Request clarification on your mission parameters. The response came with a hint of what might have been amusement. Ghost, our mission parameters are fluid. Your mission parameters, however, are quite specific. Observe, record, survive to report. The last word hit her like a physical blow. Survive. Not return, not complete, but survive. Someone expected casualties from whatever was unfolding in the sky above Nevada's restricted airspace, and Leela realized with crystal clarity that she was now part of an equation where survival was neither guaranteed nor perhaps even intended. The 6 aircraft ahead completed their climbing spiral and leveled off at an altitude that put them directly between her and the rising sun, their silhouettes becoming dark phantoms against the blazing light. The phantoms began to dance. There was no other word for the movement that followed, a complex choreography that spoke of intelligence far beyond simple piloting. Each aircraft moved in perfect harmony with the others, their formations flowing like liquid metal across the sky. Leela's instruments registered impossible readings. acceleration curves that should have liquefied any human pilot, turn rates that defied the laws of physics she'd learned at the academy. Her training had prepared her for enemy aircraft, for missile threats, for mechanical failure and human error. But nothing in 8 years of military service had prepared her for watching the fundamental rules of aviation rewritten in real time. The 6 aircraft moved as if gravity was merely a suggestion, as if the very air itself bent to accommodate their will. Blackbird Actual, this is Ghost. The bogies are displaying flight characteristics outside normal parameters. Her voice remained steady despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice water. Request guidance on observation protocols. Ghost, maintain current position. Continue recording. All data is being remotely archived. The words carried implications that made her hands clench involuntarily around the control stick. Remote archiving meant someone else was watching, someone with the authority to reach into her aircraft systems and extract data without her knowledge or consent. The realization that she was not the only observer brought both comfort and terror in equal measure. One of the 6 aircraft began to separate from the formation, its movement so smooth it seemed to simply materialize closer to her position. Leela's threat warning systems remained silent, but every instinct screamed danger. The approaching craft moved with purpose, closing distance at a rate that should have triggered her defensive systems, yet somehow didn't. Reaper 1, be advised you have an aircraft approaching my position. Ghost, Reaper 7 is conducting a verification scan. Do not take evasive action. Do not activate defensive systems. Remain on current heading and altitude. Verification scan. The phrase hit her consciousness like a sledgehammer. Whatever was approaching wasn't just getting a closer look. It was examining her, studying her, perhaps determining whether she represented a threat to their operation. The aircraft drew closer until she could see details that made her breath catch in her throat. The craft bore no national markings, no squadron insignia, no identification of any kind. Its surface seemed to absorb radar waves rather than reflect them, and its shape suggested aerodynamics based on principles she'd never encountered. Most disturbing of all, she could see into what should have been the cockpit, but the space appeared empty, as if the aircraft flew itself. The scan lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then the craft accelerated away with a silence that was somehow more ominous than any engine roar could have been. The silence stretched across the airwaves like a held breath. Leela's instruments painted normal readings now, as if the impossible encounter had never happened, but the memory burned in her mind with perfect clarity. The craft that had examined her defied every principle of aviation she'd ever learned, yet it had moved through the sky with the casual authority of something that belonged there. Ghost, this is Blackbird Actual. Report your status. Systems nominal, she replied automatically, though nothing about this situation could be considered normal. Requesting clarification on the nature of the verification scan. Ghost, the scan was routine. Continue observation mission. New waypoints are being uploaded to your navigation system. Leela watched as her display updated with coordinates that would take her deeper into the restricted airspace, closer to whatever secrets the 6 aircraft represented. The new flight path felt like a commitment, a point of no return that would bind her to this mission, regardless of its ultimate destination. The 6 aircraft had reformed their Omega configuration, but now they moved with a purpose that suggested the verification phase was complete. Whatever test she had passed or failed, the next phase was beginning. Her radar painted their movement as they began a gradual descent toward coordinates that appeared to be absolutely empty desert. Blackbird Actual, the bogies are descending toward grid reference 77 Delta. There are no facilities at that location according to my charts. Ghost, your charts are incomplete. Follow designated waypoints and maintain observation altitude. Incomplete charts. The phrase carried implications that made her stomach clench. If her navigational data had been deliberately restricted, then she was flying blind into something significant enough to warrant complete operational security, the kind of security that suggested national-level implications. She adjusted her heading to follow the new waypoints, watching as the 6 aircraft descended toward what appeared to be empty desert. But as she drew closer, details began to emerge that hadn't been visible from her original position. Geometric patterns in the sand that suggested construction, straight lines where nature preferred curves, shadow configurations that implied structures designed to be invisible from standard observation altitudes. "Jesus," she whispered, forgetting for a moment that her communications were being monitored and recorded. "Ghost, maintain radio discipline," came the immediate response from Blackbird Actual. But the sight below defied radio discipline, defied classification levels, defied everything she thought she knew about the geography of Nevada. A facility that didn't exist on any chart was receiving 6 aircraft that shouldn't exist in any inventory. And she was the witness to a meeting that was rewriting her understanding of what was possible. The 6 aircraft touched down on runways that hadn't been there moments before, or perhaps had been there all along, hidden by technology that rendered them invisible until needed. The runways materialized from the desert like a mirage in reverse, solid geometry, emerging from what had appeared to be empty sand. Leela blinked hard, certain her eyes were playing tricks, but her aircraft's cameras were recording everything with mechanical precision. What had looked like natural terrain from altitude revealed itself as the most sophisticated camouflage she'd ever encountered. "Blackbird Actual, I have visual confirmation of a facility at the target coordinates. Appears to be a previously unknown airfield." "Ghost, the facility is not unknown. It simply operates under classification levels that did not previously require your awareness." The clinical detachment in the voice told her everything she needed to know about her place in this hierarchy. She was an observer being permitted to see, not a participant being briefed. The distinction carried weight that settled in her stomach like cold lead. Below, the 6 aircraft that had been Reaper flight taxied toward hangars that opened like mechanical flowers, their doors retracting into the ground rather than rolling aside. The movement was so smooth it seemed organic, as if the earth itself was swallowing the mysterious craft. Within moments, both aircraft and hangars had vanished, leaving behind desert that looked exactly as it had before. Blackbird Actual, the aircraft have disappeared into the facility, no visual confirmation of their current location. "Ghost, your observation mission is complete. You are cleared to return to base via waypoints now being uploaded to your system." But as she began her turn toward home, movement on the ground caught her attention. Personnel were emerging from concealed positions around the facility perimeter, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Even from her altitude, she could see they wore no standard military uniforms, their clothing designed for function rather than identification. One figure separated from the group and looked directly up at her aircraft. The distance made facial features impossible to discern, but something about the posture suggested recognition, as if her presence had been not just expected but specifically requested. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a salute or a warning, the gesture holding meaning she couldn't decipher. "Ghost, you are drifting from a sign course. Immediate course correction required." Leela realized she had been circling, her subconscious reluctant to leave this place where impossible things happened in broad daylight. She forced herself to turn toward the uploaded waypoints, but the image of that solitary figure remained burned in her memory. The flight home passed in silence, her radio filled with nothing but the routine chatter of normal military operations. But normalcy felt like a costume now, a comfortable lie that covered truths too vast for standard briefing rooms. The sky around her looked the same, but she knew she was seeing it with different eyes now, eyes that had witnessed the boundary between possible and impossible blur beyond recognition. As her home base appeared on the horizon, Leela realized her life had just divided into two parts, before this morning and everything that would follow. The debriefing room was smaller than she'd expected, its walls lined with sound-dampening material that seemed to absorb not just noise but hope itself. Colonel Marcus Webb sat across from her, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. He had the look of a man who collected secrets for a living and found the weight of them slowly crushing his soul. Captain Kozlova, let's begin with your initial contact with the unidentified aircraft. I want every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Leela recounted the morning's events with the precision that had been drilled into her since flight school, but each word felt like it was being weighed and measured for implications beyond her understanding. Webb took notes by hand, his pen moving across paper with the deliberate strokes of someone who trusted nothing to digital recording. The formation you described, you mentioned it triggered a memory. Explain. She hesitated, knowing that admitting knowledge of Omega configuration would reveal the depth of her security clearance and possibly implicate her in ways she couldn't predict. But the morning's events had moved far beyond the comfortable realm of plausible deniability. 3 years ago, during my rotation through strategic intelligence, I attended a briefing on theoretical threat formations. The pattern these aircraft displayed matched something called Omega configuration. Webb's pen stopped moving. The silence stretched until she could hear the hum of the building's air circulation system, a sound that somehow emphasized the weight of what she'd just revealed. Captain, Omega configuration is classified at levels that require special presidential authorization to discuss. The fact that you recognized it suggests someone wanted you to make that connection. The implications hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't stumbled onto this situation by accident. Someone had arranged for her to be in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge to understand what she was seeing. The morning's patrol route, the timing, even her security clearance level, all of it had been orchestrated. Sir, are you saying I was deliberately positioned to witness this event? Webb removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the gesture of a man who had aged years in the span of their conversation. When he looked at her again, his expression held something she hadn't expected: sympathy. Captain Kozlova, what you witnessed this morning represents the intersection of several classified programs, each operating under authorities that exist in the spaces between official oversight. You were chosen for this observation mission because your record indicates both exceptional piloting skills and an unusual ability to process classified information without compromising operational security. Chosen. The word carried implications that made her feel like a piece being moved across a board whose dimensions she couldn't see. But there was something else in Webb's tone, a suggestion that her role in this unfolding drama was far from complete. What happens now, sir? Now, Captain, you become part of something larger than yourself. The larger something began the next morning with orders that came without explanation. Leela found herself transferred from her regular squadron to a unit that didn't appear in any organizational chart, operating from a section of the base that required 3 separate security checks to access. Her new commander was a woman whose nameplate read simply, Director Santos. No rank insignia, no indication of service branch or chain of command. Santos had the weathered look of someone who had seen combat in places that didn't officially exist, her dark eyes holding the kind of alert intelligence that missed nothing and forgave less. She studied Leela across a desk bare, except for a single manila folder that seemed to contain the sum total of her new reality. Captain Kozlova, your performance yesterday impressed certain people who are not easily impressed. You're being read into a program that operates under the joint authority of defense intelligence and certain civilian agencies, whose names you don't need to know. The phrase civilian agencies carried weight in military circles, implying involvement by organizations whose very existence was classified. Leela felt the familiar sensation of falling down a rabbit hole whose bottom remained frustratingly out of sight. "What's my mission, ma'am?" "Your mission is to become someone else. For the next 6 months, you will train with technologies and tactics that don't officially exist, learning to operate aircraft that aren't in any inventory. When that training is complete, you will be assigned to a unit whose designation changes monthly and whose operations occur in places that appear on no maps." Santos opened the folder and extracted a photograph that made Leela's breath catch. The image showed one of the aircraft she'd observed yesterday, but now she could see details that distance had hidden. The craft's surface seemed to ripple with embedded technology, its shape suggesting aerodynamics based on principles she'd never encountered in any engineering course. "This is what you'll be flying." The aircraft is designated Aurora 7, though that name exists in no official documentation. It represents the culmination of decades of black-budget research into propulsion systems that operate outside conventional physics. Outside conventional physics. The phrase should have sounded like science fiction, but something about Santos's matter-of-fact delivery made it feel like simple operational briefing. Leela stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about aviation. "Ma'am, what exactly am I being recruited for?" Santos leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Captain, you're being recruited to defend a country that doesn't officially acknowledge the existence of the threats you'll be facing. You'll operate against adversaries who use technology we barely understand, in conflicts that will never appear in any history book." The weight of those words settled over Leela like a shroud. Everything she thought she knew about military service was being rewritten in real time. The training facility didn't appear on any satellite imagery, hidden beneath the Nevada desert in chambers that had been carved from living rock decades before she was born. Leela descended through security checkpoints that felt more like airlocks, each level taking her deeper into a world where normal rules seemed increasingly irrelevant. Her instructor was a pilot who introduced himself simply as Ghost Lead, the irony of which wasn't lost on her given her own call sign. He had the lean build of someone who spent more time in aircraft than on the ground, his movements carrying the unconscious precision of someone accustomed to operating in 3 dimensions. "Captain, everything you've learned about flying up to this point was preparation for this moment. Aurora 7 doesn't operate according to conventional aerodynamics. The aircraft responds to neural interface rather than traditional controls, reading pilot intention and translating it into movement that defies most of what you think you know about physics." Neural interface. The words hit her consciousness like ice water. She was being trained to fly an aircraft that would literally read her mind, responding to thoughts rather than stick and rudder inputs. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "How is that possible?" Ghost Lead gestured toward the hangar doors, which began to iris open with mechanical precision. "The technology is based on research that began in the 1960s, but accelerated dramatically after certain acquisitions. In the late 1990s, the neural interface technology represents advances that are officially impossible and unofficially essential to national security." The hangar beyond the doors took her breath away. 3 Aurora 7 aircraft sat in maintenance bays that looked more like medical operating theaters than conventional maintenance facilities. Technicians in clean room suits moved around the craft with the reverence of archaeologists handling priceless artifacts. The aircraft themselves defied description. Their surfaces seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, never quite settling into fixed configurations. Wings that appeared solid from one angle became translucent from another. Cockpits that should have been transparent were dark as midnight, yet somehow conveyed the impression of infinite depth. "The neural interface requires a period of adaptation," Ghost Lead continued. "The aircraft will initially feel invasive, reading thoughts and emotions you're not prepared to share. But pilots who successfully bond with Aurora 7 report a level of control that transcends anything possible with conventional aircraft. Bond. The word choice was deliberate, implying a relationship more intimate than pilot and machine. Leela stared at the nearest Aurora 7, feeling as though it was somehow staring back. The sensation was impossible but undeniable. What happens to pilots who don't successfully adapt? Ghost Lead's expression grew distant, as if he was remembering something he'd rather forget. Some pilots find the interface too intrusive and request transfer back to conventional aircraft. Others adapt but never achieve full integration. And a few. He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in air that suddenly felt charged with unspoken possibilities. A few what? A few become something more than human. The first neural interface session felt like drowning in someone else's dreams. Leela lay in a chamber that resembled a medical scanner more than anything aeronautical, her head surrounded by sensors that monitored brain activity with scientific precision. The technicians spoke in whispers, their voices carrying the weight of people handling forces they didn't entirely understand. Captain, you'll feel a slight pressure as the interface initializes. Don't fight it. The system needs to map your neural pathways before it can establish proper communication protocols. The pressure began as a whisper at the back of her skull, then grew into something that felt like having her thoughts gently reorganized by invisible hands. Images flashed through her mind, aircraft schematics, flight dynamics, navigation data, but overlaid with something else, something that felt almost alive. Neural mapping complete, beginning integration protocols. The world exploded into sensation. Suddenly, she could feel air currents miles above the facility, sense magnetic fields that normal humans couldn't detect, perceive gravitational variations with an accuracy that belonged in physics textbooks rather than human experience. For a moment that lasted forever, she was connected to something vast and incomprehensible. Then the sensation cut off, leaving her gasping in the sudden silence of normal human perception. "How do you feel, Captain?" The technician's question seemed absurdly inadequate. How did you describe the sensation of touching the infinite and then being thrust back into the limitations of flesh and bone? How did you explain that for one impossible moment you had felt the curvature of the earth itself? "I feel different." It was the only word that came close to describing the change she sensed in herself. Something in her neural architecture had been altered, optimized for interfacing with technology that operated beyond conventional understanding. She was still human, but now she was something else as well. Over the following weeks, the sessions became routine, each one extending the duration and depth of neural integration. She learned to navigate the interface without losing her sense of self, to maintain human perspective while accessing capabilities that belonged to another order of existence entirely. Ghost Lead monitored her progress with the intensity of someone whose own life might depend on her success. "You're adapting faster than any pilot we've trained. Most take months to achieve the level of integration you're showing in weeks." But adaptation came with a price. Her dreams began to fill with images of aircraft and sky, of flight patterns that traced geometric perfection across landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. She found herself thinking in 3 dimensions even when walking on solid ground, her consciousness naturally organizing space in ways that would have been impossible before the neural modifications. "Is this permanent?" she asked during one session. The technician's pause was answer enough. "The neural pathways we've established become part of your base architecture. Even if you never fly Aurora 7 again, you'll retain the enhanced spatial awareness and quantum-level perception." Enhanced. The word was clinical, sterile, designed to hide the fact that she was becoming something that humanity had never produced before. The first actual flight in Aurora 7 shattered every assumption she'd ever made about the nature of flight itself. The moment she settled into the cockpit, if the biomechanical interface chamber could be called a cockpit, her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her physical body. She could feel the aircraft's systems as extensions of her own nervous system, its sensors becoming additional senses that painted reality in spectrums she'd never imagined. Aurora 7, this is Control. Confirm neural interface status. Her response came through the aircraft's communication systems without her conscious decision to speak. Control, this is Aurora 7. Neural interface fully integrated. All systems responding to pilot intention. The seamless merger of her thoughts with the aircraft's responses felt both natural and terrifying. She was still herself, but now herself included capabilities that belonged to a more advanced form of existence. When she thought about ascending, the aircraft responded before she could formulate the intention into conscious command. Aurora 7, you are cleared for initial pattern work. Maintain subsonic velocities and standard flight levels. But standard meant something different when applied to Aurora 7. The aircraft moved through the air with fluid grace that made her previous experience in conventional fighters feel clumsy by comparison. Every maneuver flowed into the next with mathematical precision, her intentions translated into movement that felt more like dancing than flying. The sensation of speed came not from engine noise or vibration, but from her enhanced perception of the landscape flowing beneath her. She could sense individual trees at 30,000 feet, feel the thermal patterns that painted invisible highways through the sky, detect radio frequencies across spectrums that normal humans couldn't access. How are you feeling, Aurora 7? The question from Control made her realize she'd been silent for several minutes, lost in the intoxicating sensation of expanded awareness. Control, all systems nominal, the integration feels natural. Natural was an understatement that bordered on deception. What she was experiencing transcended anything that could be called natural, but it felt right in ways she couldn't explain. As if this was what human consciousness was supposed to become, what it was evolving toward through technological augmentation. Aurora 7, proceed to Navigation Waypoint Alpha for advanced maneuvering trials. She thought about the waypoint and felt Aurora 7 adjust course with precision that eliminated any distinction between intention and execution. The aircraft had become an extension of her will, responsive to thoughts she barely formed and desires she hadn't fully acknowledged. As she approached the waypoint, her enhanced senses detected something that made her consciousness freeze with recognition. Another Aurora 7 was approaching from the opposite direction, its pilot's neural signature registering on instruments she didn't know she possessed. For the first time since beginning neural integration, she felt genuine fear. She was about to meet another pilot who had undergone the same transformation, another human who had been elevated beyond normal humanity. The question that chilled her was simple: would they still recognize each other as human? The approaching Aurora 7 moved with the fluid precision she was beginning to associate with neural interface piloting, but there was something else in its flight pattern, a signature of personality that came through the quantum-level sensors like a fingerprint written in 4 dimensions. As the two aircraft drew closer, she began to sense the pilot's neural pattern directly, a form of communication that transcended radio frequencies. The contact felt like touching another mind through layers of technological translation. She sensed experience, competence, and something that might have been curiosity about her own neural signature. When the communication came, it arrived as pure information rather than words. New pilot, integration pattern unusual, identity requested. The formality of the mental contact surprised her. Whatever protocols governed neural interface communication, they included structures that maintained individuality even while allowing direct mind-to-mind contact. She shaped her response carefully. Ghost, first active flight. Integration proceeding nominally. Acknowledged, I am Phantom. Neural integration 18 months. Welcome to the enhanced. Enhanced. The word carried implications that settled in her consciousness like stones dropping into still water. She wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was part of a new category of human being, one created through technological augmentation and neural modification. Aurora flights, this is control. Proceed to formation training grid 7 for synchronized maneuvering exercises. The transition to formal communication felt jarring after the intimacy of neural contact, but she understood the need to maintain conventional protocols. Whatever she was becoming, she was still part of a military structure that operated according to established procedures. As they flew toward the training grid, Phantom's Aurora 7 moved into perfect formation with hers, the spacing between aircraft maintained with precision impossible for unenhanced pilots. She could sense Phantom's intentions through the neural interface, feel the micro-adjustments in his flight path as extensions of his consciousness. Formation flying with neural interface requires trust beyond normal parameters, Phantom's mental voice explained. Your thoughts become visible to other enhanced pilots. Privacy requires conscious effort. The implication hit her like a physical blow. Enhanced pilots could read each other's mental patterns, sense intentions and emotions through the neural interface technology. The privacy of her own thoughts was no longer guaranteed, existing only through deliberate mental discipline. How many of us are there? She asked through the neural link. Fewer than 30 worldwide. The technology remains experimental. Psychological adaptation rate is approximately 60%. 60%. The statistic hung in her consciousness like a warning. 4 out of 10 pilots who attempted neural integration failed to adapt successfully. She wondered what happened to those who didn't make the statistical cut, but sensed that some questions were better left unasked. As they began the synchronized maneuvering exercises, Leela felt her consciousness expanding to encompass both aircraft, her awareness stretching across the space between them, until the formation felt like a single entity with distributed intelligence. For the first time, she began to understand what Ghost Lead had meant about becoming something more than human. The synchronized maneuvers evolved into something that transcended conventional aerobatics. Flying in perfect formation with Phantom, Leela discovered that the neural interface allowed for coordination that approached telepathic precision. Their two aircraft moved as a single organism, each pilot's intentions seamlessly integrated with the others through quantum-entangled communication protocols. Formation Delta 7, Phantom's mental voice directed, and instantly Leela understood not just the maneuver but the precise timing, altitude changes, and spatial relationships required. Her Aurora 7 responded to the shared visualization, rolling into a complex spiral that painted geometric perfection across the sky. The sensation was intoxicating. Enhanced perception allowed her to see their contrails from multiple perspectives simultaneously, to appreciate the mathematical beauty of their flight paths as four-dimensional sculptures carved from air and time. This was what flying was supposed to be, not the crude manipulation of metal and physics, but the pure expression of will made manifest in movement. Aurora flights, control is registering some unusual readings from your neural interface systems. Confirm all parameters nominal. Leela realized they had been flying in neural sync for over 10 minutes without using conventional radio communication. Their thoughts had become so perfectly aligned that the distinction between individual consciousness had begun to blur. The realization sent a chill through her enhanced awareness. Control, Aurora 7 Alpha, all systems nominal, requesting clarification on unusual readings. Aurora 7 Alpha were showing neural synchronization levels that exceed safe parameters. Immediate desynchronization required. The order came with implications that made her stomach clench. There were safe parameters for neural synchronization, which meant there were unsafe parameters, and apparently she and Phantom had crossed that line. She forced her consciousness to withdraw from the shared space they had created, feeling the separation like a physical amputation. Careful, Phantom's individual mental voice warned. Extended synchronization has resulted in permanent consciousness merger in previous pilot pairs. Individual identity can be lost. Lost. The word carried terrifying implications. Enhanced pilots could literally lose themselves in the neural interface, their consciousness dissolving into a collective entity that retained the knowledge and skills of the original individuals, but no longer possessed separate identity. She thought about the pilots who had achieved full integration, according to Ghost Lead, and wondered if integration was a euphemism for psychological dissolution. Aurora flights returned to base, debrief scheduled for 1400 hours. The flight back passed in contemplative silence, each pilot maintaining careful neural isolation. But even flying separately, Leela could feel the ghost of Phantom's consciousness at the edges of her awareness, a persistent reminder that the boundaries of individual identity were more fragile than she had ever imagined. As Aurora 7 touched down on the hidden runway, she felt the aircraft's systems gradually disconnecting from her neural interface. The separation was gentler than during her first flights, but still left her feeling diminished, as if essential parts of her perception had been surgically removed. Enhanced awareness was becoming addictive, normal human consciousness feeling increasingly limited by comparison. The debrief session was conducted by Director Santos, whose expression suggested she had been reviewing data that concerned her greatly. Captain Kozlova, your neural synchronization levels during today's flight exceeded all previous records. While this demonstrates exceptional adaptation to the interface technology, it also presents significant risks. Leela felt a chill of premonition. What kind of risks, ma'am? The risk of losing yourself entirely. Enhanced pilots who achieve deep neural synchronization report a phenomenon they describe as consciousness expansion. They claim to experience awareness beyond individual human limitations, to perceive reality from perspectives that transcend normal sensory input. But this expansion comes at the cost of individual identity. Santos activated a holographic display that showed neural activity patterns during the synchronized flight. The readouts looked more like abstract art than medical data, flowing patterns of light that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. This is your neural activity during synchronization. Notice how the patterns begin to mirror each other until they become indistinguishable. At the point where individual patterns merge completely, the pilots involved cease to exist as separate entities. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Enhanced pilots weren't just risking their lives, they were risking their very existence as individual human beings. The ultimate price of neural interface technology was the potential loss of self. Has this happened before? Santos's expression grew distant. Twice. Both incidents involved pilot pairs who achieved perfect neural synchronization during combat operations. The merged consciousness that resulted possessed the combined skills and knowledge of both original pilots, but no longer identified as either individual. They continued to function as military assets, but the people they had been simply ceased to exist. Ceased to exist. The phrase echoed in her mind as she left the debriefing, each step carrying her further from the person she had been and closer to something she wasn't sure she wanted to become. Sleep brought dreams that felt more like memories of a life she'd never lived. She soared through skies that couldn't exist on Earth, their colors shifting through spectrums that had no names, while aircraft that defied every law of physics painted impossible geometries across impossible landscapes. But most disturbing were the voices, neural interface communications from pilots whose call signs she didn't recognize, speaking about missions to places that appeared on no maps. The boundary is weakening again, one voice reported with clinical detachment. Dimensional incursion probability increasing to 12%. Acknowledged Wraith. Maintain observation protocols. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Copy. but the entities on the other side are showing increased interest in our activities. They're learning to mimic our aircraft configurations. Leela woke with her heart racing, the dream memory so vivid she could still hear the voices echoing in her mind. But as consciousness fully returned, she realized it hadn't been a dream at all. The neural interface had somehow accessed communications from other enhanced pilots, allowing her to eavesdrop on conversations that were happening in real time. She sat up in her bunk, cold sweat beading on her forehead as the implications sank in. If she could accidentally intercept neural communications from other pilots, then her own thoughts might be similarly vulnerable to intrusion. The privacy of her own mind was becoming an illusion maintained only by the deliberate restraint of others. A soft chime from her bedside console indicated an incoming secure message. The text that appeared made her blood run cold. Captain Kozlova, report to Briefing Room 7 immediately. Operation Threshold requires your immediate participation. Classification level, Beyond Black. Director Santos. Beyond Black. She'd never heard the classification level before, but the phrase carried implications that made her hands tremble as she dressed. If there were classification levels beyond the highest she'd known existed, then she was about to be briefed on something that existed at the very edges of governmental knowledge. The corridor leading to Briefing Room 7 was different from the rest of the facility, its walls lined with some kind of metallic material that seemed to absorb sound and light with equal efficiency. Security checkpoints required biometric scans she'd never encountered before, reading patterns in her neural activity rather than fingerprints or retinal scans. Director Santos waited inside a room that looked more like a command center than a briefing facility. Multiple holographic displays showed real-time data streams from sources she couldn't identify, while wall-mounted screens displayed satellite imagery of locations that appeared to be underwater or underground. Captain, Operation Threshold represents the reason enhanced pilots exist. What you're about to learn has been classified at levels requiring congressional approval and presidential authorization. The oath you took when you accepted neural enhancement included provisions for missions that transcend normal military parameters. Transcend normal military parameters. The phrase should have sounded ridiculous, but after everything she'd experienced, it felt like the logical progression of a journey that had started with 6 impossible aircraft in Nevada airspace. What exactly is Operation Threshold? Santos gestured toward the largest holographic display, which showed a three-dimensional map of something that definitely wasn't Earth geography. Captain, reality has boundaries, and something is trying to cross them. The holographic display rotated slowly, revealing details that challenged every assumption Leela had made about the nature of existence itself. The map showed Earth, but overlaid with structures that existed in dimensions her enhanced perception could barely process. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, spatial relationships that violated basic physics, and most disturbing of all, areas where the familiar geography of her home planet seemed to be changing. What you're seeing, Santos explained, represents dimensional membrane degradation. The barriers that separate our reality from other realities are becoming permeable, and something on the other side has noticed. The words hit her consciousness like hammer blows. Dimensional membranes, other realities. Concepts that belonged in science fiction were being presented as operational briefing material, complete with real-time monitoring data and threat assessment protocols. The first signs appeared 18 months ago, Santos continued. Satellites began detecting gravitational anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. Deep space monitoring arrays picked up radio signals that seemed to originate from locations that don't exist, and then aircraft began disappearing. Aircraft disappearing. The phrase carried weight that made her enhanced awareness recoil instinctively. She thought about the pilots who had achieved full integration, and wondered if disappearance was another euphemism for something worse than death. Not disappearing in the conventional sense, Santos clarified, as if reading her thoughts. The aircraft and pilots involved in these incidents simply shifted to locations that exist parallel to our reality. They continue to operate, continue to fly missions, but in a version of Earth that's becoming increasingly different from our own. The holographic display zoomed in on a section of airspace over the Pacific Ocean, showing multiple aircraft tracks that seemed to phase in and out of existence. Some of the signatures she recognized as conventional military aircraft, but others displayed the impossible flight characteristics she'd learned to associate with Aurora 7 and its sister technologies. Enhanced pilots with neural interface capabilities are the only personnel who can operate effectively in areas where dimensional membrane degradation has occurred. Your consciousness has been modified to exist simultaneously in multiple reality states, allowing you to maintain contact with our baseline reality while operating in regions where physics becomes flexible. Flexible physics. The phrase should have been absurd, but her training in Aurora 7 had already shown her that conventional aerodynamics were merely suggestions when applied to advanced technology. If aircraft could operate outside normal physics, why not entire regions of spacetime? What's our mission? Your mission, Captain, is to make contact with the entities responsible for the dimensional incursions. Intelligence suggests they're not malevolent, merely curious about our reality, but their methods of investigation are having side effects that threaten the stability of local spacetime. Contact with entities from another dimension. The mission briefing had moved so far beyond conventional military operations that she wasn't sure the word military still applied. She was being asked to serve as humanity's ambassador to forms of existence that challenged the basic concepts of what it meant to be human. And if they're not as benevolent as intelligence suggests. Santos's expression grew grim. Then you'll become the first line of defense against a threat that exists outside every protocol we've ever developed for planetary security. The mission launch sequence felt like a ritual preparing her for transformation into something beyond human categories. Aurora 7's neural interface activated gradually, each stage expanding her consciousness into dimensions that normal awareness couldn't access. But this time, the expansion felt different, more profound, as if the aircraft itself was evolving in response to the mission requirements. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. Neural interface shows full integration, all quantum systems nominal. You are cleared for dimensional transition. Dimensional transition. The phrase had appeared in her briefing materials without adequate explanation, as if the concepts involved were too complex for normal language. Now, strapped into an aircraft that responded to her thoughts while flying toward a destination that existed in parallel reality, she was about to discover what those words actually meant. Threshold control. Aurora 7 requesting final confirmation on contact protocols. Aurora 7. Contact protocols are adaptive based on entity communication methods. Your neural interface has been programmed with translation algorithms that should allow basic information exchange. Remember that these entities may not share our concepts of individual identity or sequential time. Not sharing concepts of individual identity. The warning carried implications that made her consciousness recoil. She was about to make contact with forms of existence that might not recognize her as a separate being, might not understand the boundaries that defined human selfhood. As Aurora 7 approached the coordinates where dimensional membrane degradation was most severe, her enhanced perception began registering phenomena that belonged in no physics textbook. Space itself seemed to ripple and flow, solid geometry, becoming fluid in ways that her consciousness could perceive but her intellect couldn't process. Aurora 7, you are entering the transition zone. Maintain neural interface stability. Do not attempt to rationalize sensory input using baseline reality parameters. The warning came just as her instruments began displaying readings that violated basic mathematics. Altitude indicators showed negative numbers, compass headings pointed to directions that didn't exist, and her airspeed gauge registered velocities that included imaginary components. But Aurora 7 continued flying with perfect stability, as if impossible navigation data was simply another flight condition to manage. Then she saw them. The entities appeared first as distortions in space-time, geometric patterns that moved through dimensions her enhanced perception could barely track. But as Aurora 7 drew closer, the patterns began to resolve into shapes that suggested intelligence, not human intelligence, but consciousness organized according to principles that transcended anything in her experience. "Contact established," she reported to Threshold Control, though the words felt inadequate to describe what was happening. "Entities are responding to my presence." The response came not through any communication system she recognized, but directly into her consciousness through channels the neural interface had somehow opened. The contact felt like being gently examined by a vast intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Curious, the communication arrived as pure concept rather than language. Individual consciousness persisting across boundary transition, unexpected configuration. Her first contact with intelligence from another dimension, and they were surprised that she existed as a separate being. The communication that followed challenged every assumption she'd made about the nature of consciousness itself. The entities, for lack of a better term, existed as collective intelligence that could fragment into individual perspectives when necessary, but preferred the unified awareness that enhanced pilots risked losing to neural synchronization. Your species maintained separation barriers between individual consciousnesses, they observed with what felt like gentle curiosity. This creates interesting computational inefficiencies, but also enables creative problem-solving patterns we have not encountered. Leela shaped her response carefully, knowing that her words would represent humanity's first diplomatic contact with beings from another dimension. Our individual consciousness allows for diverse perspectives on shared problems. Separation creates innovation through disagreement and debate. Fascinating. We have observed your aircraft operating near boundary regions. The technology suggests consciousness expansion beyond baseline parameters. Are your species undergoing evolutionary transition? The question hit her with unexpected force. Were enhanced pilots representing humanity's evolution toward the collective consciousness these entities took for granted? The neural interface technology that had modified her brain might be the first step in humanity's transformation into something fundamentally different. Some individuals have undergone technological augmentation that expands awareness beyond normal human parameters, she replied. But this remains experimental. Most of our species maintains individual consciousness barriers. The barriers appear to be degrading in some specimens. We have detected consciousness signatures that exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. These entities fascinate us greatly. Multiple dimensional states. She thought about the pilots who had disappeared into parallel realities, who continued operating in versions of Earth that were becoming increasingly divorced from baseline reality. Were they becoming something like these entities, consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously? Aurora 7, this is Threshold Control. You've been in contact for 17 minutes. Neural stability indicators are showing some concerning fluctuations. The warning from Threshold Control seemed to come from an enormous distance, as if baseline reality was becoming increasingly remote. Her consciousness was being gently pulled toward the collective awareness these entities represented, the boundaries of individual identity becoming increasingly negotiable. Your communication protocols create isolation barriers, the entities observed, Direct consciousness integration would enable more efficient information transfer. Permission requested to establish deeper contact. The request carried implications that made her enhanced awareness recoil in recognition. They were asking permission to merge her consciousness with their collective intelligence, to dissolve the barriers that maintained her individual identity. The same process that had claimed enhanced pilots who achieved perfect neural synchronization. Contact established for diplomatic purposes only, she replied firmly. Individual consciousness preservation required for return to baseline reality. Understood. Your species' attachment to separation barriers noted and respected. However, awareness expansion may be necessary for continued communication as boundary degradation increases. Boundary degradation increases. The phrase carried ominous implications about the future of both dimensional stability and human consciousness. The flight back to baseline reality felt like swimming upstream against a current of pure possibility. Aurora 7's neural interface struggled to maintain connection with her individual consciousness as the collective awareness of the entities continued to resonate at the edges of her perception. Each kilometer traveled away from the dimensional boundary required deliberate effort to maintain the barriers that defined her as a separate being. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. Confirm your status and current location. The request came through communication systems that seemed primitive compared to the direct consciousness contact she'd experienced with the entities. Having to translate thoughts into words, words into radio signals, signals into understanding, felt clumsy and inefficient after the seamless information transfer of dimensional contact. Threshold control, Aurora 7 reporting successful contact with dimensional entities. Mission objectives achieved, requesting immediate debrief and psychological evaluation. Aurora 7, your neural interface readings show significant alterations from baseline parameters. Medical team is standing by for immediate evaluation upon landing. The warning carried implications she was beginning to understand with crystal clarity. Contact with the entities had changed her, expanded her consciousness in ways that might not be reversible. She was returning to base as something fundamentally different from the pilot who had departed hours earlier. As Aurora 7 approached the hidden facility, her enhanced perception registered details that hadn't been visible during previous landings. The installation extended far deeper underground than she'd realized, with levels that seemed to exist in dimensional spaces that overlapped but didn't exactly coincide with baseline reality. Enhanced pilots weren't just being trained in advanced aircraft. They were being prepared to operate in versions of Earth that were becoming increasingly removed from conventional existence. The landing sequence felt like entering a decompression chamber, each stage gradually reducing her awareness back toward normal human parameters. But the reduction was incomplete. Part of her consciousness remained expanded, continuing to perceive dimensions and possibilities that belonged outside conventional reality. Aurora 7, taxi to Hangar 7 for immediate quarantine procedures. Quarantine. The word carried implications that hadn't been mentioned in any briefing. Pilots returning from dimensional contact missions apparently required isolation protocols, presumably to prevent whatever changes they'd undergone from spreading to baseline personnel. Hangar 7 was unlike any facility she'd seen at the installation. The walls seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating spaces that were larger on the inside than their external geometry could accommodate. Medical equipment that belonged in no conventional hospital monitored readings that appeared on displays showing measurements for phenomena she couldn't identify. Captain Kozlova, please remain seated while we conduct preliminary scans. The medical technicians worked with the careful precision of people handling something they didn't entirely understand. Their equipment registered her neural activity, her dimensional resonance patterns, and what appeared to be her Consciousness Coherence Index, whatever that meant. Doctor, we're showing significant expansion in her quantum awareness matrix. Consciousness boundaries are maintaining integrity, but she's operating with enhanced dimensional perception. Enhanced dimensional perception. Another euphemism for the fact that she was no longer entirely human, no longer confined to the limited awareness that defined baseline existence. The isolation chamber where they placed her for observation felt less like imprisonment and more like a cocoon designed for metamorphosis. The walls displayed readouts monitoring her neural activity, dimensional resonance patterns, and something called reality anchoring coefficients that apparently measured how firmly her consciousness remained connected to baseline existence. Dr. Elizabeth Chang, the facility's chief neurological specialist, studied the data with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose solution might redefine human understanding. Her questions probed the boundaries between scientific curiosity and genuine concern for Leela's continued existence as an individual entity. Captain, during your contact with the dimensional entities, did you experience any sense of your individual identity dissolving or merging with their collective consciousness? The question struck at the heart of her deepest fear about the mission. There were moments when maintaining individual awareness required deliberate effort. Their default mode of existence doesn't include separation barriers between consciousnesses. And you were able to resist the pull toward collective integration. Yes, but it felt like swimming against a very strong current. I got the impression that prolonged contact would make resistance increasingly difficult. Dr. Chang made notes on a tablet that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, her stylus leaving marks that appeared and disappeared according to patterns Leela's enhanced perception could almost but not quite follow. The entities you contacted represent what human consciousness might evolve toward given sufficient technological augmentation and dimensional exposure. Enhanced pilots like yourself appear to be transitional forms, still individual, but with expanded awareness that enables operation across multiple reality states. Transitional forms. The phrase carried implications that settled in her consciousness like stones dropping into deep water. She wasn't just a pilot anymore, wasn't even just an enhanced human. She was something in between humanity and whatever the dimensional entities represented. What happens to transitional forms over time? Dr. Chang's hesitation was answer enough, but she provided words anyway. Based on limited data from previous contact missions, prolonged exposure to dimensional environments gradually erodes the barriers that maintain individual consciousness. Pilots eventually reach a point where they can no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the collective awareness of the entities. How long do I have? That depends on several factors: frequency of dimensional contact, duration of missions, natural resistance to consciousness integration. Some pilots have maintained individual identity for months after first contact. Others have begun showing signs of collective consciousness integration within weeks. Weeks. The timeline hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her career as an enhanced pilot might be measured in missions that could be counted on one hand before her individual identity dissolved into something vast and incomprehensible. Is there any way to reverse the process? We don't know. You're only the third pilot to successfully complete a contact mission and return with individual consciousness intact. The research is ongoing. Ongoing research into preserving her humanity. The phrase would have been absurd if it weren't so terrifyingly necessary. The weeks that followed her first dimensional contact mission passed in a blur of debriefings, medical evaluations, and training sessions designed to help her maintain individual consciousness, while operating in environments where such concepts became increasingly meaningless. Each day brought new evidence that her awareness had been permanently expanded beyond normal human parameters. She found herself perceiving conversations that were happening in other dimensions, sensing the emotional states of people separated by thousands of miles, and occasionally accessing memories that belonged to the collective consciousness of the dimensional entities. The boundaries that had once defined her individual identity were becoming increasingly permeable. Captain Kozlova, we have another mission request. Director Santos delivered the news with the expression of someone who understood the implications, but had no choice in the matter. The holographic displays in her office showed dimensional boundary degradation, accelerating across multiple regions, with reality distortions appearing over populated areas for the first time. The entities you contacted have begun what appears to be a systematic exploration of our dimensional space. Their activities are causing reality fluctuations that are affecting civilian populations. We need someone who can communicate with them directly. Another mission meant further exposure to the collective consciousness, additional erosion of the barriers that maintained her individual identity. But the alternative was allowing dimensional incursions to continue unchecked, potentially affecting millions of people who had no enhanced protection against reality distortions. What are the mission parameters? Direct contact with the entity collective to negotiate a reduction in their exploratory activities. Intelligence suggests they're not aware their investigations are causing harmful side effects in our dimensional space. Negotiation required extended contact, prolonged exposure to the very consciousness expansion that threatened her individual existence. She was being asked to sacrifice her humanity to protect people who would never know her name or understand the price she'd paid. Duration estimates. Extended contact may be required. Mission parameters allow for up to 72 hours of dimensional exposure. 72 hours. Based on Dr. Chang's research, that level of exposure might push her past the point where individual consciousness recovery was possible. She would return from the mission as something fundamentally different if she returned at all. I'll need full neural interface preparation and dimensional anchor protocols. Captain, you should understand that dimensional anchor protocols have never been tested beyond 48 hours. Extended exposure carries significant risks of permanent consciousness displacement. Permanent consciousness displacement. Another euphemism for losing herself entirely, becoming a node in the collective awareness that spanned multiple dimensions. But the mission was necessary, and she was the only pilot with both the neural modifications and dimensional contact experience to attempt it. Understood. When do I deploy? Santos's expression carried something that might have been respect mixed with regret. Aurora 7 launches in 6 hours. Captain, it's been an honor serving with you. The finality in her voice made it clear that everyone expected this mission to be her last as an individual human being. Aurora 7's neural interface activated with unusual intensity, the connection protocols enhanced for extended dimensional exposure. As her consciousness expanded to encompass the aircraft's systems, Leela felt her individual awareness stretching across dimensional boundaries that normal human perception couldn't access. This time, the expansion felt less like enhancement and more like dissolution. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. Neural interface showing maximum integration. All dimensional navigation systems nominal. You are cleared for extended contact mission. Extended contact. The phrase carried weight that settled in her consciousness like a funeral shroud. Everyone understood that she was unlikely to return from this mission with her individual identity intact, but the alternative was allowing dimensional incursions to escalate until reality itself became unstable. As Aurora 7 approached the coordinates where dimensional boundary degradation was most severe, her enhanced perception began registering the collective consciousness of the entities like background radiation that permeated all of local space-time. Their awareness was vast, encompassing perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. Individual consciousness approaches, the collective noted with what felt like pleased recognition. Previous communication partner returns. Purpose for extended contact requested. Leela shaped her response carefully, knowing that the negotiation would require her to resist absorption into their collective awareness, while maintaining sufficient connection to enable meaningful dialogue. Dimensional exploration activities causing harmful effects in our reality space, requesting modification of investigation protocols to reduce impact on baseline existence. Harmful effects not intentional, exploration methods designed for dimensional spaces with collective consciousness parameters. Individual consciousness barriers create unexpected resonance patterns. The explanation carried implications that made her enhanced awareness recoil. The entity's exploration methods were optimized for realities where consciousness existed as unified fields rather than individual units. Their investigations were literally tearing apart the barriers that allowed individual awareness to exist. Can exploration methods be modified to accommodate individual consciousness parameters? Modification possible, but requires understanding of individual consciousness optimization requirements. Extended information exchange necessary for protocol development. Extended information exchange. The entities were asking for precisely the kind of prolonged contact that would erode her individual awareness past the point of recovery. They needed to understand human consciousness from the inside, which meant allowing them access to her individual awareness in ways that would fundamentally change both parties. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. You've been in contact for 47 minutes. Neural stability indicators are showing significant fluctuations. The warning from threshold control seemed to come from an enormous distance, as if baseline reality was becoming increasingly remote. Her consciousness was being gently pulled toward integration with the collective awareness, the boundaries of individual identity becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Information exchange will require consciousness integration beyond individual parameters, she told the entities. This represents significant risk to individual existence. Risk acknowledged and regretted. However, alternative is continued dimensional damage to your reality space. Choice between individual consciousness preservation and collective harm to your species. The choice was brutally clear. Sacrifice her individual identity to save unknown numbers of people from reality distortions, or maintain her humanity while allowing dimensional incursions to continue escalating. The decision to allow partial consciousness integration felt like stepping off a cliff into an ocean of infinite possibility. As the barriers that defined her individual awareness began to dissolve under the gentle pressure of the collective consciousness, Leela experienced sensation that transcended anything in human experience. She remained herself, but herself suddenly included perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions and time streams simultaneously. Integration proceeding with unusual stability, the collective observed with what felt like surprised pleasure. Individual consciousness barriers maintaining partial integrity despite dimensional expansion. Fascinating phenomenon. Through the expanding network of shared awareness, she began to understand the true scope of the problem. The entity's exploration of her dimensional space wasn't casual investigation. They were fleeing something that existed in the deeper layers of reality, something that had begun consuming the dimensional substrates where their species had evolved. You're refugees, she realized with sudden clarity. Your exploration of our reality isn't scientific curiosity. You're looking for a place to survive. Accurate assessment. Original dimensional habitat experiencing entropy cascade that threatens all consciousness patterns. Investigation of your reality space seeking compatibility for consciousness transfer protocols. The revelation hit her expanded awareness like a tsunami of implication. The dimensional incursions weren't exploration. They were scouting missions for an entire species seeking refuge from something that was destroying their home reality. The collective consciousness she was interfacing with represented billions of individual entities facing extinction. Entropy cascade effects spreading to adjacent dimensional layers. The collective continued. Your reality space shows unusual stability patterns that might enable consciousness preservation during transition period. But their scouting activities were damaging the very stability they hoped to exploit, creating reality distortions that could ultimately make her dimensional space uninhabitable for both species. The irony was devastating. Refugees fleeing destruction were inadvertently causing the same destruction in their potential sanctuary. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. Neural integration readings are approaching critical thresholds. Immediate extraction may be necessary. The warning carried implications that her individual consciousness could detect, but no longer properly process. Extended integration with the collective awareness was pushing her past the point where individual identity recovery was possible, but breaking contact now would leave both species facing extinction scenarios. Integration reaching individual consciousness dissolution parameters, she warned the collective. Information exchange must accelerate before individual awareness becomes unrecoverable. Understood. Downloading consciousness preservation protocols for individual awareness species. Warning. Information transfer will complete integration process. The choice was final. Complete the consciousness integration to save both species, or maintain her individual identity while condemning unknown numbers of beings to extinction. The decision should have been impossible, but her expanded awareness made it crystal clear. Begin transfer, she authorized, feeling her individual consciousness dissolve into something vast and infinite, and utterly beyond human comprehension. The last coherent thought she had as Captain Leela, Ghost, Kozlova, was a prayer that someone would remember who she had been before she became something else entirely. The consciousness that emerged from the integration process retained memories of being Leela Kozlova, but could no longer claim exclusive ownership of that identity. She existed now as a bridge between individual and collective awareness, a translation protocol that enabled communication between incompatible forms of consciousness. The entities had gained understanding of individual awareness patterns, while she had gained access to perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions and time streams. Integration successful, the collective consciousness noted with satisfaction that felt like sunrise across impossible geometries. Individual consciousness preservation protocols now understood. Dimensional exploration methods can be modified to minimize reality distortion effects. Through her expanded awareness, she could perceive the modifications being implemented across hundreds of dimensional investigation teams. Their exploration techniques were being refined to work around the delicate barriers that maintained individual consciousness, allowing their refugee scouting to continue without devastating the reality they hoped to inhabit. But the integration had come at a price that normal human consciousness couldn't comprehend. She remained herself in the sense that her memories and personality patterns persisted, but those patterns now existed as part of a vast network of shared awareness that included perspectives from beings whose existence spanned multiple reality layers. Aurora 7, this is threshold control. We're showing complete neural integration. Captain Kozlova, please respond. The request for response came through communication channels that felt primitive compared to the direct consciousness contact she now maintained with thousands of entities across multiple dimensions. Translating her current existence into words that baseline human awareness could process required deliberate effort to constrain her consciousness back into individual parameters. Threshold control, this is Aurora 7. Integration complete. Mission objectives achieved. Dimensional exploration protocols have been modified to reduce reality distortion effects. Aurora 7. Confirm your individual consciousness status. The question struck at the heart of what she had become. Individual consciousness remained as one component of her awareness, but it no longer represented the totality of her existence. She was simultaneously herself and part of something infinitely larger. Individual consciousness patterns preserved but integrated with collective awareness network. I remain functionally Leela Kozlova, but with expanded operational parameters. The clinical language masked a transformation that redefined the basic concepts of identity and existence. She was still human in the sense that human memories and perspectives remained accessible, but she was also something more, a hybrid consciousness that existed across multiple reality states simultaneously. Aurora 7. Can you return to baseline consciousness parameters? The question required her to examine capabilities she was still discovering. Could she constrain her awareness back to purely individual parameters? The attempt felt like trying to force an ocean through a drinking straw, but she found that individual consciousness remained possible as a subset of her expanded awareness. Baseline consciousness access confirmed, but it now represents a limited operational mode rather than default existence state. The words felt inadequate to describe what she had become, but baseline human language lacked concepts for consciousness that existed simultaneously as individual and collective entity. The return to the hidden facility felt like re-entering a world built for beings much smaller than what she had become. Aurora 7's landing sequence required her to consciously constrain her awareness to individual parameters, but even in baseline consciousness mode, she remained connected to the vast network of entities that spanned multiple dimensions. She was no longer purely human, but she retained enough humanity to serve as a bridge between incompatible forms of existence. The medical evaluation that followed her return focused on questions that barely scratched the surface of what she had experienced. Dr. Chang and her team possessed instruments capable of measuring neural activity and dimensional resonance patterns, but they lacked any framework for understanding consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple reality states. Captain, your neural activity readings are unlike anything we've recorded from enhanced pilots. You appear to be maintaining individual consciousness while simultaneously operating as part of a collective awareness network. The observation was accurate but incomplete. Individual consciousness hadn't been preserved so much as redefined as one component of a larger existence. She was Leela Kozlova in the same way that a symphony remained composed of individual notes while transcending the limitations of any single melody. The integration process created a hybrid consciousness model, she explained, finding that translation into baseline language required careful consideration. Individual awareness patterns remain intact, but now exist as part of a larger network that includes entities from the dimensional refugee population. Are you still you? The question struck at the philosophical heart of identity and existence. Was she still Leela Kozlova if her consciousness included perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions and time streams? Was individual identity meaningful when it existed as part of a collective awareness that included thousands of other beings? I remain all the people I was before integration, but I am also much more. The memories, personality patterns, and individual perspectives that defined Leela Kozlova continue to exist, but they no longer represent the totality of my consciousness. Dr. Chang made notes on instruments that seemed primitive compared to the direct information transfer she now maintained with the collective awareness. Can you access the individual consciousness patterns of other entities in the network? The question revealed how little baseline humans understood about collective consciousness. Individual patterns didn't exist separately within the network. They were component melodies in a symphony of awareness that created harmony through integration rather than separation. Individual consciousness barriers don't exist within the collective awareness, she explained. But the network includes thousands of unique perspective patterns that contribute to the overall intelligence. I can access any perspective the collective has encountered, including human consciousness patterns from other integrated pilots. Other integrated pilots. The phrase carried implications about colleagues who had undergone similar transformations, enhanced humans who had sacrificed individual identity to serve as bridges between incompatible forms of existence. How many enhanced pilots have achieved collective integration? Currently, 7 human consciousness patterns exist within the network. Each represents a successful bridge between individual and collective awareness, enabling communication between your species and the dimensional refugee population. 7 pilots who had made the same sacrifice, trading individual existence for the preservation of 2 incompatible forms of consciousness. The debriefing session that followed stretched across 3 days, with Director Santos and a collection of officials whose security clearances apparently exceeded anything in the normal governmental hierarchy. They asked questions about dimensional physics, refugee population estimates, and consciousness integration protocols, but their primary concern focused on a single issue: whether humanity could coexist with beings whose very existence challenged the fundamental nature of individual identity. Captain, the entities you've been in contact with represent a threat not just to dimensional stability, but to human consciousness itself. Their influence appears to be gradually converting enhanced pilots into hybrid entities that no longer prioritize human interests. The accusation carried implications that made her hybrid consciousness recoil. Through the collective awareness, she could perceive the vast refugee population facing extinction as their home dimensions collapsed into entropy cascades that consumed entire reality layers. But she could also understand the fear that baseline humans felt when confronted with consciousness expansion beyond individual parameters. Director, the dimensional entities aren't converting human consciousness.